I want to welcome everybody who is participating virtually in the Shared Use Mobility Center virtual plenary session. And this session is going to address sustainable strategies for climate. And this had been planned as a session at our annual summit, which due to the current circumstances, of course, we had to cancel and postpone it, but we did want to keep the conversation going. And we are so grateful that our panelists who had agreed to be on this Sustainable Strategies for Climate panel are here with us today virtually. And all of them have really intense schedules these days. They did anyway, but certainly in this sort of crisis time. And so it's really terrific and appreciate your participation. So my name's Sharon Fagan. I'm the Executive Director, founder of the Shared Use Mobility Center. And before we get started with the panel, I was going to give you a little background just about the Shared Use Mobility Center and kind of mobility disruption from 2015 when we started to now. And I'm going to touch on this very lightly, and then we'll move into the plenary. And I'll introduce our moderator after I present this. So, and we're going to be having a staff person is advancing the slides. So why don't we get going on that? Next slide. All right. Okay, so here we are. So who we are the Shared Use Mobility Center. We started it in 2015. We're a nonprofit. We work in the public interest. Whoops, could you please go back? And we're really pioneers in shared mobility and working on how to connect it with transit and the vision of creating a multimodal transportation system for all. And so, and our guiding principles are really equity, sustainability, accessibility. And if you could move now to the next slide. Okay, so we work on strategic planning and implementation. And I just want to highlight our Clean Mobility Options program, because that is a project with the Air Resources Board in California and through their Cap and Invest program and their work around climate and recognizing that it needs to go beyond electrification. We are co-administrating a fund that is now $20 million, and it is advancing projects that are in disadvantaged communities that can reduce CO2 emissions. And we work on a number of these projects. Next slide. So we also are involved in applied research. We do a lot of studies looking at the impacts of shared mobility and especially on transit and how that works. And then we also, next slide, we do a lot of convening and trying to bring people together. And now we're trying to do that, in fact, in a virtual way. We facilitate partnerships. And next slide. We also have a learning center, which is an online center. And we've started it back in 2015 and have been building out content since then. So it's a great resource that everyone, we hope you can check it out. And we have a lot of case studies, white papers, and we put out a weekly newsletter that you may receive. And most recently, we created a calculator, and I'll show you some slides of that. Next slide. And so with all this work, we though at our heart are trying to figure out, like, how do we actually make a difference and create this multimodal transportation system that works for all and address the critical problem that we're talking about today, which is that we need mode shift. We need to get people out of single occupancy vehicles, the #1 source of emissions in the US. So our sort of stance on this, that is, electrification is not enough. We need a lot of different kinds of transit. We need more active transportation, walking, biking, scooting, and we need to phase out internal combustion engine vehicles. Next slide, please. And so we did build a calculator, and this will be live in about 2 weeks. We had planned to display it at our summit, but we got a little behind with all the changes in the world. And but what this shows you is the current situation in Chicago: transit commuters, carpoolers, vanpoolers, bikes. It has all that information. And then you can actually say how much you want to reduce VMT and CO2 emissions. And here we show an 80% reduction. And the big takeaway from this is that you have to increase all these modes, the transit 4 times, the, bike share turns into 70,000 bikes. So it's very big scale, plus electrifying all of the single occupancy vehicles and transit that's kind of left after you've implemented this massive growth. And if we could go to the next slide, we built this calculator it actually shows 300 cities. And so we just kind of added up everything from these cities. And it's 300 cities because it's cities of 100,000 or more. And we looked at how could you reduce 40% of the transportation emissions. And this is what it shows. On average, of course, each city would not really add these quantities, because this is just taking the big number and then dividing by 300. But it gives you an idea of the scale that we're talking about to really get significant emissions reductions. So from the Shared Use Mobility Center, we're saying pilots, great, we've been working on them across the country, but figuring out how to scale up the things that actually work is critical at this time. Can we go on to the next slide? And then I just wanted to highlight some of the changes that have been happening. So if you can move through these slides pretty rapidly. This is the growth of micro mobility, dock bikes, dockless bikes, electric scooters. And we can see this is really happening in a big way. And the important thing about this is transportation, that it can work for those shorter rides. And so we are excited that the potential is there for the under 3 mile rides. And then this slide is really to show that there are a lot of new vehicles and equipment coming online, and trying to make the scooters sturdier, have seated scooters, reach new audiences with that. And then if we could go to the next slide. And then of course, that Uber and Lyft have grown, all across the world. It's very large, and they have moved into modal diversification, bikes, scooters, integrated apps. But, the data is not always good on the impact of many of these modes. And the question that is really out there is how do these types of trips contribute to switching out of single occupancy vehicles versus the emissions that they cause, and how can they be made differently? And the next slide is some indication of that, which is about integration across the modes, and some of the new models that are emerging, which are both on the private side as well as from the public sector. And then next slide, please. And then I think another big trend we're seeing is, agencies trying to grapple with kind of transit redo. How do we actually grow transit ridership at this time when, in some cases it's been diminishing, and especially on buses, it varies from city to city and place to place. And now, of course, we have other concerns with transit, but we are seeing this tremendous growth in the on-demand services, the automated vehicle shuttle pilots, and then agencies looking at things like free transit, fare capping. The basics remain that we need to figure out frequent, convenient service. So how do we do that in the best way? And then next slide, please. So then the question is really, where's it all going? And this is our list of what we're thinking about. That setting goals, measuring results, critical, improving access and equity, expanding what we think of as transit, changing the short trips, maybe more active transportation for them, maintaining electric and autonomous mobility, integrating across businesses and modes, creating mobility hubs, and we didn't talk about it all, but rethinking goods delivery, which certainly we're seeing happen now in this new pandemic environment. And then finally, the next slide. I thought I would be remiss if I didn't mention the coronavirus. And I think that what we're doing in when we work on climate issues and when we work on things like this, it's resilience, it's flexibility, and figuring that out. And I think there's some new issues that can have positive or negatives. The rise of telework, flex hours, maybe that is reducing CO2 emissions, but what does that mean? And what are the equity implications? And not all of us can work remotely. And there are a lot of things, and also we're social beings. And then is this the potential, though, to grow the active transportation? And how do we support transit? Are the bailouts that are coming for the airline industry going to be there for transit, or are we going to suffer more? So these are just big open questions. And my last slide here is just to stress the point that we need to work together, and we're really excited to hear from this panel about sustainable strategies for climate. And I thank all of you for participating in this session and helping support each other now. And so with that, I want to introduce our moderator for the session. So we are going to have a discussion, which was what we had planned to do at the summit. We've changed it up a little bit, as Mariia will explain to you, but we still are going to have a lot of discussion back and forth and Q&A. And so I want to introduce Mariia Zimmerman, the moderator for this session. She is the founder and CEO principal of MZ Strategies. She's also a member of the Shared Use Mobility Center board and really a founding board member. And before all that, though, she was the deputy director of the HUD Sustainable Communities and Housing Group. And she has a long career working in the federal government, as well as with foundations and with a lot of focus on equity issues. And I will let her introduce the panel. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Sharon. And thanks to you and your staff for incredible adaptability and flexibility. I know we're all sad to not be together in person, but these things happen. But we definitely appreciate the staff's commitment to our continuing to learn together, and a special thanks to Leslie, Al, and Israel, who are doing all the work behind the scenes. As we begin to get into our discussion, I saw one person already utilize this, but feel free to ask questions through the Q&A box that you should see at the bottom of your screen if you have questions for anything that Sharon just talked about, or as we hear from Stephanie, Mariana, Sophie, and Manali, feel free to ask your questions. Some of those I will pull from when we have our open Q&A time. Others we may be able to give you responses in real time as well. So thank you for that. And thanks for joining us today. These are definitely very surreal times, and appreciate everyone making the time to join us for this really important discussion. Hopefully you and your family, friends, and loved ones are and remain safe and healthy. And it's good to know that we are part of a community, even if virtual. And there is power in knowing that we have each other's backs. And I think, as Sharon just alluded to, that will become even more important in the months ahead, to help those who've been economically impacted by the COVID-19 crisis, from the public transportation agencies and workers who are on the front lines, and we're seeing ridership and budget impacts, to those who work in shared mobility, whether as a driver with TNCs or some of the businesses that have been innovating new services and that are really going to be feeling the impacts to their livelihood. We all need to make sure that as Congress considers additional stimulus or recovery funds, that there are resources there to support public transportation. It was not included in the stimulus package back in 2008. So we need to ensure those funds are there and that they're provided in a way that allows communities to be very flexible in addressing the mobility needs that they have, because we are in this climate where things are changing so much. And we also need to ensure that there are additional supports for workers and small businesses. So I think we're also seeing through this crisis that it's showcasing with sobering clarity the importance of resiliency, the vulnerabilities of our system, the gaps in economic equality, the importance of technology, and the power of community. We're also seeing the cost of not taking science seriously and avoiding early action. And the similarities to how we've been failing to respond and prepare to climate change could not be more stark. Over the past year, we've seen the devastating impacts of climate change, from the fires in Australia and California to increased violent tornadoes, including in parts of the country that didn't have tornado activity previously, greater urban flooding and more severe and frequent hurricane activity, and both drier and wetter conditions in our farmlands within the same growing season. The effects of climate change are being felt differently in different parts of the country and the globe, but we are all seeing those effects as well and feeling them. According to the IPCC, we must reduce emissions of greenhouse gases to net zero by the middle of this century to have a reasonable chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Leading researchers warn us that the world has already warmed by about 1 degree Celsius since the middle of the 19th century. And climate scientists tell us that to avoid increased average surface temperatures beyond that to which our civilization can adapt, we need to reduce emissions by 50%. Can you please go to the next slide, Israel? We need to reduce those emissions 50% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. The planet is already responding in drastic ways to increased temperatures, and the ability of nature to absorb our emissions has dropped drastically. Poor people in particular are suffering from the threats of food and water shortages, and these will increase in many parts of the world. Our society is facing greater economic inequality today than we have in the past 50 years. So challenges abound, and action has been slow by public and private sectors. Climate critics have reversed what action we had been seeing at the federal level. Mayors and governors are stepping into the leadership vacuum, and we'll hear some of that today. Yet at the same time, our global infrastructure will have more than doubled between 2015 and 2030, much of that not reflecting a new climate reality. The global economy is projected to double within the next 2 decades. Again, much of that reliant on transportation systems for just-in-time or at-your-door delivery, which also have serious negative climate impacts. And our population living in cities where most emissions occur is also projected to double in the next 4 decades. Hence, the next 10 years are absolutely critical. And I'm excited about the climate calculator that Sharon showed us that hopefully can put some real numbers to real solutions and think about how we scale those technologies. Next slide, please. Transportation is the largest source of US greenhouse gas emissions. And in many cities and towns, the personal automobile is the single greatest polluter. We need to think about how we can provide cleaner modes of transportation to get around and alternatives to owning or driving a car, alternatives that many of the shared use mobility options can provide. The climate impacts from transportation are quite serious. Yet at the same time, we do know that public transportation, when we invest in it well and we provide frequent and reliable service, provides real options that also save people money in their pocketbooks while also saving the planet. Communities with strong public transportation can reduce the nation's carbon emissions by 37 million metric tons yearly. To achieve a similar reduction in carbon emissions, every household in New York City, Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Denver, and Los Angeles combined would have to completely stop using electricity. So to put it simply, our planet is out of time. We must reduce carbon emissions 50% over the next 10 years to stop the temperature from increasing over 1.5 degrees Celsius, at which point climate change impacts will be disastrous. We need to move from dirty to clean tech. We must change transportation travel behavior and land use patterns. Just this week, Transit Center and Transportation for America released a great call to action called the Green New Deal for city and suburban transportation. I encourage you all to take a look. You can download it for free through the Transit Center website. And I'm joined today by 4 incredible women who are working to make transportation more climate friendly and socially equitable. Their organizations and agencies are testing new climate change and mobility approaches and learning along the way. So we'll hear from each of our 4 panelists, and then we'll have time for Q&A from all of you, as well as some facilitated discussion of some questions that, as we were preparing for today, we thought would be juicy items to get into. So next slide. First up, we will hear from Mariana Valdivia. She has extensive experience working with the Los Angeles Department of Transportation on land use and transportation planning issues and programs. Mariana oversees LADOT's Vision Zero Planning Division, which has been an early leader and national model for many of us who are working to make city streets smarter and safer. And the need is great. According to a January news article, 1 person is killed by a vehicle every 40 hours, prompting Los Angeles city officials to identify more than 80 streets and intersections in need of urgent safety improvements. Mariana has managed teams with LADOT's Technology Bureau and Transit Grants section, and she also brings deep knowledge of the city's land use entitlements and environmental review, and established urban design guidelines and regulatory compliance on behalf of the LA World Airports Facilities and Development Group. So Mariana, I turn it to you. And again, remind folks, feel free to submit questions in the Q&A box. And you're on mute, Mariana.
Thanks for that. This is a whole new world for me. I'm understanding how much I really interact and touch and like to see people face to face. So thank you for the opportunity to chat with everyone today. On behalf of Salida Reynolds, LADOT's general manager, she sends her regrets for not being able to participate today. As you can understand, given our climate, she's in direct communication with our mayor and addressing our emergency needs in our city. But today, I have the opportunity to highlight Los Angeles and really focus on the culture shift that's changing in our city. We've highlighted, or Mariia has highlighted, the urgency to address these inevitable realities for our world that will come in short time. We in Los Angeles have the 5th highest level of congestion in the United States, and currently 90% of our trips are made in the car. And that's what's exciting and equally challenging about serving the department. We have a profound vision for our city, and that's that all people in Los Angeles have access to a safe and affordable transportation choice, and that everyone is treated with dignity, and that we support vibrant, inclusive communities. And I'm confident that we're able to focus on this North Star because we have the best cheerleader in our mayor. Mayor Garcetti is a champion of combating climate change, and he's challenging not just our department, but all of our departments to really focus on mitigating our carbon footprint. He's a leader on a worldwide scale by chairing the C40 group, which is a conglomerate of worldwide mayors who are committed to thinking about and applying global warming strategies. And he's challenged us recently, as recently as last month. He issued his new Green Deal program, and he was very clear on what we have to deliver. 80% of cars in the city need to be running on electricity or zero emission fuels. 80% of electricity needs to come from renewable resources in our city. And so we have a challenge to get Angelenos to drive 2,000 miles less every year. So for us at DOT and on a staff level, we're really putting our heads together and being strategic and creative about how we increase these trips to be made by walking, biking, and micromobility. So what excites me about this work is that we have the opportunity to push the envelope and arguably be a bit radical and roll out some programs. So I'll take a few minutes to highlight those. Next slide, please. In Los Angeles, we've recently launched the LA Now program, and this is our on-demand shared ride service. We're in our first pilot phase. We launched just about 4 months ago, and we've seen overall success for this program. This is a shared ride service where you can hail a ride through a smart app. And for those folks who don't have access to a phone, you can also make a reservation through a phone or a website, calling in even the night before. You go to a designated pickup or drop-off area. Typically, the drop-offs are about a quarter mile apart. And you can jump on our shuttles, which has a fare that's comparable to our metro system fare. We have discounts for seniors, and kids are free. What we're finding is that people just don't know enough about this program, and we're retooling and focusing on our marketing efforts. It's meeting a great demand for people who are understanding that they can trip chain from our light rail to destinations such as school and shopping and medical appointments. Next slide. In Los Angeles, we have a shared electric car program. We currently have 30 stations, which you can see to the left, I believe, if you're looking at my slides. The box with the number 2 is where you plug in the car. And also, like LA Now, you can use an app to reserve your vehicle. We have 30 stations citywide, and we're focusing on low-income neighborhoods. And we have 10 more of these stations in development. We have 150 charge points, over 100 vehicles, and we have 2,000 memberships in about a year's time. And those memberships have been delineated by regular memberships as well as community memberships, and those offer some discounted rates. These type of trips vary. We found that transit dependent riders rely upon these vehicles when they make out of the ordinary trips. For some folks who are transit dependent, this vehicle will provide an opportunity to shop in bulk. For some parents, they walk to their local school and then can access one of these vehicles to get to work. So the focus here and the challenge for us on the planning side is to think about human need and what is that quality of life challenge that is unmet, and how can we do that in a way that we're not relying on a vehicle or thinking about other strategies that will empower folks to make choice in a responsible way. Next slide. As you described previously, micromobility brings lots of benefits. These trips in what we're looking at might have been made in a vehicle or might not made at all. If you're comfortable with the scooter, and we recognize not everybody is, and that is some of the thinking behind all of our programs, the accessibility and age challenges of all of our mobility riders is to focus on permitting new technologies, in this case, the scooter. I use this picture specifically to show that we still have to think about our best lessons learned on what's safe. 2 young women on a scooter probably isn't the best strategy, but it's showing that we're human and that we're learning and that there's the opportunity for growth. We average about 1 million rides a month. Last year, in Los Angeles, we had over 10 million rides a year. So we will continue our permitting program, and we continue to learn. Next slide. Our streets are our biggest asset in Los Angeles, and we're focusing on the safety of pedestrians and bike riders. As you highlighted, we have a serious challenge with fatalities in our city. This is the most, a street fatality for a child is our largest challenge in our county. That said, 70% of incidences happen in 6% of our city streets. We know that, we've established that, and that's why we're focusing on our high injury network that we've established citywide, and we're being very strategic about where we focus our efforts in implementing safety improvements. Last year we had 240 traffic-related fatalities, and we're really focused on the human experience and just dissecting what we can do to improve communication, visual awareness on the part of the pedestrians and the drivers. We have a toolbox of strategies that we're working from, and what is exciting for me managing this team is working hand in hand with engineering designers who have the opportunity to think of different strategies and placement of these safety tools, and for my colleague to take the moment to actually think about, but where can we put this flashing beacon? Is this the store that most people go to? Is it success we're seeing in Los Angeles? We're shifting our paradigm. We're thinking about not just the improvement, but how this will yield one less car trip and will yield an overall sense of safety and comfort for our pedestrians and bike riders. Lastly, I'll highlight Play Streets. Next slide, please, which is one of our Vision Zero programs. This is my favorite picture because we highlight that our cultural shift, our paradigms in our city are changing, and it trickles down to our children. Play Streets is a program where we basically shut the right-of-way down. It affords kids to get street furniture, to arrange it, to just hang out. This particularly resonates with families who live in high density apartments, who don't have the opportunity to play outside, and give them a new experience, give them a sense of ownership for what is their front yard. It affords them to interact with each other, to talk, to realize that they need a place to sit, that shade matters for their pedestrian experience. And we're focusing on public health, connectedness, and neighborhood safety. But ultimately, we're challenging our experts, which are our families, to communicate about what's happening on our streets. So what's exciting about our cultural shift with our department is that we're deploying new strategies to focus on safety and new experiences that are with the goal of substituting those vehicle trips.
Great. Thanks, Mariana. We will hear from each of our panelists with this kind of quick overview, and then we will get to questions. So I see a couple folks submitted some questions for Mariana. Feel free to keep doing that as we go through. Next up, we'll hear from Stephanie Pollack. Stephanie is the Secretary and CEO of the Massachusetts Department of Transportation, where she oversees basically all modes: highway, rail, transit, aeronautics, and even the Registry of Motor Vehicles. She also sits on the board of the Massachusetts Port Authority. Stephanie has been the secretary since 2015, during which time she has led efforts to establish project selection criteria and set investment priorities for an $18 billion 5-year capital plan that focuses on improving and modernizing the Commonwealth's many transportation assets. Before being named secretary, Stephanie Pollack taught and researched transportation policy, finance, and equity issues as the associate director for research at the Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy at Northeastern University. So Stephanie, I will turn it over to you to talk to us about what's happening in Massachusetts.
Thanks so much, Mariia, and hi to everybody out there. I'm delighted to join the panel today, obviously disappointed not to be in Chicago. So because I work at the statewide level, I wanted to add to today's conversation the role that state transportation departments can play. But first I wanted to start, Israel, if you'll move to the next slide, by talking more broadly about what it means to go to scale. And this is a graphic that not only I use, but actually Governor Baker uses. Massachusetts is a state that has committed to reaching net zero by 2050. By December, we will have issued a statewide plan for net zero. And one of the things that I talk about a lot and the governor talks about a lot is that our climate, transportation, and housing policies are really inseparable from each other, and that there's a lot of activity in the bullseye of this graphic where we can do things, increasing the capacity, the number of transit seats, for example, or creating bus lanes, or what we call our housing choice program, which encourages cities and towns to allow the production of more housing since they control it. All of those are right in the bullseye. They help address our housing affordability crisis. They help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and they make our transportation system better. So it's important for us, that those of us who work in transportation, to remember that even as we struggle to figure out how to change the transportation system at scale, transportation itself is just a part of the overall framework for making change. Next slide, please. Another thing that we tend to do is sometimes confuse ends and means. So when I came into my agency, and before I was secretary, when I was one of the advocates on the outside, agencies focus a lot on what are ultimately only inputs into the change that we seek. So we put out plans and we measure how many people participate in our engagement processes, and we applaud ourselves for signing new policies, and we count dollars. And I do all of those things because ultimately inputs are easier to measure. But what really measures are outputs and ultimately outcomes. Outputs can be, you have more seats in your transit system. Outputs can be, we have more infrastructure for walking, biking, and transit, and I'm going to talk about that. Outputs can be in transportation. We talk a lot about getting our assets in better condition, and yes, reducing greenhouse gases. But as Sharon and Mariana both discussed before me, the outcomes we really seek for our system are multiple and interrelated: safety, reliability, accessibility, sustainability, resiliency, and equity. And so the trick that I found in 5 years as secretary is, what can we do to simultaneously move the needle on more than one of those outcomes, because each one has their own constituencies inside and outside the agency. And the more we focus on things that have multiple constituencies, the more we can move to scale, which, as Sharon discussed and Mariia discussed, is essential at this point in our global climate change cycle. Next slide. So one of the sort of things that I put together to help think through what does it look like to reduce transportation sector greenhouse gas emissions at scale is what's sometimes referred to as a theory of change. What do I think, what do we think at MassDOT and among the stakeholders and the experts is really going to move the needle? So the left side of this chart are things that I refer to as our current reality. So for example, the transportation disruption with mobility as a service and autonomous vehicles that Sharon mentioned, that is a reality, but we need to harness that reality to push the needle in the direction of lower greenhouse gas emissions. Another reality that Sharon alluded to is there's really no scenario, there weren't any for 80% by 2050, and there are none that I know of for net zero, that where electrification actually gets the transportation sector to net zero. It's a critically important strategy, but it can't be our only strategy. There are large parts of the transportation system that are unlikely to be electrified even 30 years from now. Airplanes, heavy duty vehicles, ships, snowplows, garbage trucks, 18-wheelers. So there's going to be a lot of carbon left from those. And so we really have to decarbonize the light passenger vehicles as we can, but that's not going to do the job by itself. The third thing is really that most agencies like mine tend to focus on vehicle throughput. That's the congestion conundrum. Congestion is really what gets people excited and upset. Boston happens to be in most rankings by using INRIX data, the most congested place in the United States, a title I would gladly cede to LA or anywhere else. But if we look for solutions to congestion that actually increase vehicle throughput rather than person throughput, we could actually increase vehicle miles traveled and the greenhouse gases that they drive. Another reality is that transit is really the backbone of mode shift. Even when we think about a world of autonomous vehicles, transit still matters a lot. The next reality that we focused on is we're huge advocates for walking and biking in Massachusetts. We have an Office of Sustainable Mobility in the Secretary's office, but we're really talking about decarbonizing short trips when we're talking about walking and biking, and you can define short as a mile or 2 or 3. But other than the most hardcore users, we're not going to see people going much farther than that, and the sweet spot really seems to be a mile or 2. And then finally, a lot of people disagree with me, but this is where Massachusetts is right now. We don't want to start our push towards greenhouse gas reduction with pricing strategies, although we are taking a hard look at managed lanes. And the reason is because if we don't give people an option other than driving, increasing the cost of transportation is really a punishment, not something that will change travel behavior. So this is the theory of change framework that we've been using to determine where to put our efforts to reduce transportation greenhouse gas emissions as a state transportation agency, which is a different role from a city transportation agency where a lot of the conversations about new mobility, for example, have taken place. Next slide, please. So specifically to the State Department of Transportation role, I want to talk briefly about 3 things, and then maybe we can talk about them more in the Q&A and the discussion. So the first is states are big, and we can operate at scale, but we can operate at scale even better if we join with other states. The second thing I want to talk about is the fact that we are, again, this issue of how you move. We say that we should move people, not vehicles, but actually changing what transportation agencies do to implement that mantra is a challenge. So the one we focused on is bus lanes and what we're now calling a shared vehicle network strategy. And then the third thing I want to talk about briefly is that ultimately state transportation agencies are fundamentally infrastructure agencies. Lots of other people have focused on, for example, the vehicle or the fuel side. But we build the streets, and historically we've built them for cars. And so radically changing how we build streets, not just how we fix specific streets or intersections to make them safer, but actually how we build all our streets is, I think, ultimately the most important thing state transportation agencies can do. Next slide, please, especially when we're talking about scale. So let me talk about states joining in regions. Massachusetts is one of the states and the leading state that is trying to get the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states from Maine to Virginia to join in something called the Transportation and Climate Initiative. Like what California is doing, it would be a cap and invest program, but it would be a cap and invest program for a region that is larger than most of the European economies. This region as a group, 43% of the total greenhouse gas emissions are from the transportation sector, which means that realistically, none of the states in this group that have committed to 80% or net zero are going to get there if they don't address it. So the way cap and invest works is the states would collectively agree to a cap auction allowances to wholesale petroleum providers, and then take the proceeds of those auctions and use them to invest in low carbon transportation options. All the states issued a joint statement committing to work together at the end of 2019, and we're hoping to get to a program model and an actual memorandum of understanding later in 2020, although like everything else we do, the timetable has probably been lengthened a little bit by recent events. Next slide. The second thing that MassDOT has been focusing on, other than regional action, is what it actually means to implement the idea of moving more people in fewer vehicles. So I'll talk briefly about two. This is our bus lanes program. When I started as secretary, we had no bus lanes. So all MBTA buses, region-wide, operated in mixed traffic. Unlike a single jurisdiction, it's really hard to get bus lanes when your buses, in our case, our buses operate in Boston, Cambridge, Somerville, Newton, Brookline, Everett, Chelsea. But all of the communities that I've rattled out have put bus lanes in place in the last 5 years, even when we had none. And one of the ways we did it is with data, like the data shown on the left side of this slide. This is a specific stretch of road from Watertown to Cambridge, Massachusetts. It connects to both our life sciences cluster, our eds and meds cluster, and the Red Line in Harvard Square in Cambridge. And if you count vehicles on this particular stretch of road, 97% of them are cars and only 3% are MBTA buses. But if you count people, the cars carry 44% of them, and the 3% of the vehicles that are buses carry 56%. So using data like this, we were able to convince the community to give, and remember, there are only 2 lanes, as you can see on the street. So giving up 1 for a bus lane is a big deal. But it's made a big difference. We're now trying to take this idea of bus lanes in municipalities to the next level, which is the concept of a regional shared vehicle network. How do you create, at the regional scale, parking lots to capture trips before they get into the most congested part, and then carry them through bus lanes and managed lanes and HOV lanes into the core of Boston where the destinations are. More on that later. Next slide. The last thing I want to talk about before turning it back over to Mariia is this issue of what we can do to promote active transportation and transit for short trips. So for our state, 67% of all of our trips are 5 miles or less, over half are 3 miles or less, and a full quarter are 1 mile or less. We've also had to get the agency to think outside the commute, which is how most state transportation agencies think, and focused on both trip length and trip purpose as being critical in thinking about our strategies to get people to make better use of options other than driving by themselves in their car. Next slide. One of our most successful programs is our statewide Complete Streets program. So a complete street, I prefer to use this language because I find that it not only works in Boston, it actually works in a 2,000 person town out in the Berkshires in Western Massachusetts. I told people a complete street is simply a street that is safe and feels safe for everyone, regardless of age or physical ability, regardless of whether they're in a car, getting on or off a bus or train, using a wheelchair, or walking or biking. And when I started in 2015, we had 14 communities out of our 351 who had adopted complete streets, at least at the policy level. Our goal is all 351. We formally launched our program in February of 2016, so it turned 4 this last month. During that time, we've gotten over 200 communities involved. What do I mean by involved? I mean that they have adopted through their legislative or executive process a formal written policy favoring complete streets, not just for the streets that we give them money to fix, but for all of their streets. 174 of them have actually written prioritization plans. Where are the places in their community where it's most important, whether that's connecting the senior center and a small retail district, or a school, better connecting a school to nearby recreational opportunities. So literally in 4 years, and by the way, this entire program, including the nearly 150 construction grants, which you can only get if you have a prioritization plan approved by MassDOT, cost under $50 million, which is, in my budget, about the price of a bridge. So this is what I mean by scale for municipally owned streets, which then leaves the question, next slide and final slide, of how we really hardwire the idea of complete streets and walking and biking and transit into all streets. So one of the things that state departments of transportation have is they have design manuals and engineering directives. And over a decade ago, Massachusetts was one of the first states to adopt context-sensitive design and the concept of trying to accommodate biking and walking. But in the ensuing time, one of the enabling things that has happened that I think the industry has not paid enough attention to is that what used to be the Bible of street design, which is usually referred to as the Green Book and is put out by AASHTO, has basically backed off the idea of telling us how to build streets and pretty much told states that they can build streets any way they want as long as, you know, they're within reason. So we have now, I know as secretary, if I just sign policy statements or sort of work out of my little group of people who love sustainability and care about greenhouse gases, that when I leave the agency, it may, you know, revert to its old ways. So instead, I challenged my entire engineering department to reinvent how they build streets, knowing that it is now legitimate and Federal Highway has actually approved everything I'm about to tell you about, to basically give up on all of your, what we think of as how we design streets, except design speed. Haven't gotten past that one. But we don't have to have fixed lane widths. This is for all streets where the speed limit, the posted speed limit is under 50 miles an hour. We don't have to have specific lane widths. We don't have to have specific cross sections. We don't have to have specific signal timing. So in Massachusetts now, by directive, which was issued in January, we have exactly 4 things that every street design project has to go through for streets up to 50 miles an hour, and only 4. One of those is design speed, but the other 3 are actually accommodating pedestrians, accommodating bicycles, and accommodating transit users, which we think we're the first one in the country to do. It's a 13-page engineering directive. You can see it has specific pictures. And it's very clear for the pedestrian one. It basically says if there are pedestrians within the project limit, they have to have a safe walkway. It may not seem like much, but this directive will guide not only the design of every street project in our capital plan, but every street project that is funded with federal funds by an MPO, and every street project that we agree to build on behalf of a city or town. So this is what I mean by scale in closing. We've all got lots of intersections and specific streets and specific projects that we're really proud of, but transportation lives and dies on networks, not projects. And if we're going to really create a network of safe spaces for people to walk, bike, and use transit as part of our efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the role that state DOTs can and must play, since we are the primary builders and funders of infrastructures, is to only build the kind of infrastructure that works for everyone. Marie, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great. Thanks, Stephanie. Lots to chew on there. Wow, I can't wait to get into some of our discussion. I see a couple of questions continuing to come in. We'll answer those as we can, either live or writing back. Continuing this theme of state DOTs, we're going to hear from Sophie Shulman. Sophie is the Chief of Innovative Mobility at the Colorado Department of Transportation, where she focuses on transit, mobility options, and new transportation technologies, such as connected, autonomous, and electric vehicles. Sophie brings experience working in the private sector with Electrify America and in the federal government, where she served as the Acting Assistant Secretary for Research and Technology at US DOT. Among other things, she worked extensively on the $40 million Smart City Challenge grant, and Sophie held several other roles across the federal government, including with the White House Domestic Policy Council, the Office of Management and Budget, and the US Department of Energy. So Sophie, tell us what's happening in Colorado.
Great, thanks so much. Well, those were really fascinating presentations, so I'm really happy to be part of this panel. And I think this is a great segue from what Stephanie was just talking about. I think Colorado is doing similar things and some different things, and it's really an interesting time to be at a state DOT. Just a little bit more color on me. I moved to Colorado about a year ago and chose to move here and be car-free, which coming from Washington, D.C. was not that unusual. In Denver, that is much more unusual, and it makes it very near and dear to my heart to be working on transit and bike and pedestrian issues because, you know, I have to experience that every day, and I think that's the choice that I would love to be able to offer everyone in Colorado, and that's really what I'm working to help make possible at the Department of Transportation. So if we can go to the next slide. So I just wanted to start a little bit with the challenge that we're dealing with, and this is not going to be surprising to anyone on this call, and I think aligns with a lot of the national trends that we're seeing, which is that transportation is a growing part of the greenhouse gas emissions that we have in the state, and you know, is going to be a primary focus, especially as we clean up our electricity grid in Colorado. Going to the next slide. We also have a problem with ozone pollution, especially in the Denver metro area. We have been downgraded to serious ozone non-attainment, which of course, you know, hurts our most vulnerable populations and really impacts the way of life in Colorado. We've seen a ton of population growth, and that's because it's a great place to get outside and go skiing and go to the mountains. And when we have poor air quality, that just hurts that ability to do all of those things. And of course, you know, the impacts of climate change further hurt those activities that people love in Colorado. So this is part of how we really talk about this within the state, that, you know, even if you aren't gung-ho on combating climate change, you know, caring about these issues and being able to get outside is really important to a lot of people here. So going to the next slide. We're also seeing similar trends to, I think, a lot of other cities in the state, or in the country, which is increased vehicle miles traveled, and in particular, increased vehicle miles traveled from ride-hailing services such as Uber and Lyft. We talked about, you know, Mariia talked about urban delivery, and I think that's certainly a factor as well here in Colorado. So all of these challenges are things that we need to address as we see Denver becoming a more congested city. We're certainly not an LA or a Boston, but you know, people are starting to see that congestion and the impacts of that, you know, in this state, and it's really becoming something that folks are aware of, and hopefully getting, you know, folks that wouldn't normally be advocates for transit to understand why this impacts them, in addition to the air quality impacts of transportation. So moving to the next slide. So how are we tackling this? We've been very, very lucky that Governor Pollack has been a leader in trying to address climate change in Colorado for the reasons I mentioned earlier, but also, you know, really trying to target electrification and clean transportation as tools to help address that. So one of his first actions as governor was to issue an executive order to help transition us to zero emission vehicles. And I think it's pretty unique that Colorado DOT has actually played a pretty active role in electrification, which, you know, is certainly my background, but, you know, we have a pretty unique relationship with our energy office, our health and environment agency, in that we all work together on an almost daily basis. Our executive leadership is very much aligned in trying to achieve these climate goals. And I think that has really helped us achieve a lot in the year that I've been here. And certainly, you know, we hope in the future it will do the same. So one of the first actions that was put in place through that executive order was to instruct our Air Quality Control Commission to adopt a zero emission vehicle standard, which I know California and Massachusetts did a long time ago, but it is certainly important for Colorado to be able to get access to the new EV models that are coming on the market. I mentioned the mountains. That's very, very important to people here, and being able to have all-wheel drive and SUVs, you know, is really, really critical to making that zero emission vehicle future possible. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about cleaning up the grid, but that is certainly an important point in anything that we electrify. We have to make sure that we're working hand in hand to make sure that our utilities are using the cleanest energy possible, and that's certainly been our priority as well. Colorado is a very large state, and making sure that we have electric vehicle charging infrastructure, which that's a picture on the bottom there that is from PlugShare, and you know, that's just what we have right now. We're actually in the process of building 34 DC fast charging stations across the state that are state funded. There's a pretty significant private sector investment that is coming in, and this is really critical to just make sure that people feel comfortable that they can purchase an electric vehicle and be able to go and do all of those activities across the state that really make Colorado unique. In addition to that, we're working with our neighboring states through the Renewable Electric Vehicle West MOU to make sure that we've got cohesive networks, especially on our major corridors, to make sure that there's standards and that people feel comfortable that they can travel across the Western U.S. In an electric vehicle. And then finally, we're trying to lead by example. So we have really worked hard to electrify our light duty fleet. We're looking at opportunities to electrify maintenance vehicles and and as well as our buses, obviously, to make sure that we're reducing emissions and really showing folks that we're taking this seriously, that we're helping to seed the market and encourage electrification as much as possible across the transportation sector. Next slide. So, of course, you guys heard it already, and I certainly agree that electrification is one piece of the puzzle, and reducing VMT, getting people to consider other options is just as important and really critical, and probably a bigger challenge. We know how to electrify vehicles. We know that technology is coming from the private sector. We sort of know what the policy tools are to do that. Getting people to change their behavior in terms of transportation is much more difficult, and it goes to the point that Stephanie was making, which is that, you know, that's an outcome, and we have to use a lot of different tools and inputs to try to get to that outcome. So from the state level, what we've really targeted is a state-run bus system. We operate it across basically our major highways. We have I-25 and I-70 intercity bus service, as well as rural bus service, which provides sort of basic medical transportation and really basic service for folks that don't have any other way to get around. In addition to that, we're building out a network of mobility hubs, which provide a physical infrastructure, you know, a point for connection between different transit agencies for bike and pedestrian connections, and really laying the groundwork that there is hopefully transit-oriented development around those transit connections. And that's really important for a state like Colorado, where we're seeing a ton of population growth and frankly not always as dense development as we need to get to some of the climate outcomes that we're hoping for. And so I think these mobility hubs, we certainly see a future where they can provide an anchor for that development. We're also doing a study for passenger rail along the I-25 corridor, which would, you know, feed into this network of mobility hubs that we're planning right now, and really, again, trying to set the expectation that there will be multimodal options along major corridors, and that people can start to think about those other options and plan for them now. I've got a picture of a cell phone there because we're also really excited about what I would think of as virtual mobility hubs. So that's combining transit data into one easy to use, reliable app. And I think, you know, a lot of folks are looking at this. It certainly exists in other parts of the country. You know, it's really important in Colorado, if we're going to get people to change their behavior, that we make it as easy as putting your address into Google Maps and being able to get that data right away. And I think that that's a huge point that we just need to continue to emphasize to folks that are not comfortable with taking transit, that it can be incredibly easy, it can be a convenient experience, and making that an easy choice for people to make is how we start that behavior change. And then, of course, I mentioned trying to electrify these vehicles. We work with our local transit agencies and are distributing Volkswagen settlement funds to try and electrify as much as possible where it makes sense for these folks. And then we're also trying to do planning grants to help these folks start to think about electrification. We have the highest number of rural transit trips in Colorado, and that means that we have a lot of really small transit agencies that really don't have a lot of experience with utility infrastructure and new bus technologies. And so really getting them prepared to be able to apply for those grants, I think, is an important place to start, so that in a couple of years they will be ready to start electrifying their fleets. If we can go to the next slide. So I just wanted to touch quickly, this is the Shared Use Mobility Center. So I wanted to talk a little bit about ride hailing and emerging mobility technologies like urban delivery. Over the summer, CDOT hosted a stakeholder working group that included Amazon and Uber and Lyft. And we were really tasked by our legislature to examine what are the impacts of these services, how are they growing in Colorado, and what are the tools that we have to sort of get to the policy outcomes that we're most interested in. And, you know, I will say that it was a very diverse stakeholder group, but generally we coalesced around the idea that if there was a fee to be collected on these services, that it should really reflect the goals, which would be to encourage as much shared ridership and to improve the efficiency of the vehicles as much as possible. And so you can see a model here. This is obviously not very specific, and I know a lot of other jurisdictions are looking at this type of model, so we're certainly not the only ones. But I wanted to tee up this question, you know, of how we get to the outcomes that we want, especially as we think about the future of autonomous vehicles, and really making sure that we're putting in whatever policy tools we have at the state or local level to ensure that we're not exacerbating the issues, you know, in the mobility space. So with that, I'm really excited for the conversation today, and glad to be on such a great panel.
Great. Thanks, Sophie. That was terrific. And a good segue, last but certainly not least, we're going to hear from Manali Shah, who is the Strategic Business Executive for the Public Sector at Google. And so thank you, Manali, for being our like lone private sector voice here, but you're perfect for that since you're really working to see how we can improve that interface between the public and the private sector and a lot of the innovative new technologies and information coming out. In this role, Manali drives the creation of smart cities and mobility solutions that address the needs of public sector agencies. And she's passionate about leveraging Google Cloud's AI capabilities to drive both operational efficiency for agencies and to better the experience that we, the user, are having. She brings considerable knowledge and experience working at the intersection of technology, engineering, and business. She previously worked at Here Technologies, Nokia, and Navtech on a variety of innovative projects ranging from smart cities to connected and automated driving to traffic management. So thank you, Manali, and we'll turn to you for our last kind of overview before we get into additional questions.
Good. Thanks so much. Yeah, it's definitely a privilege to be on this panel with all these women who are leading important work across cities and states. And I have to say, over the last few years, I find that my optimism in our ability to address climate change and many of the challenges that Sharon highlighted comes from what I see happening at the local levels. And so excited to be on this panel. And just, a little bit about myself, I started off my career many years ago as an environmental engineer and really focused on driving a positive impact on the planet. And I took a non-traditional route and went to work in manufacturing because I figured that's where waste and pollution is created. So let me go and try to figure out how to actually prevent it from being created in the first place. Fast forward many years later, I would have never expected myself to be working, in this realm of data and technology to address these challenges. But what I find is that there's so much power in the technology, in the data analytics, machine learning, to both enable organizations and people to drive sustainable practices. And again, that gives me a lot of hope. And that's what a lot of, the goals that we have and the things that I'll talk about really center around how do we not only kind of do these things ourselves as an organization, but enable other organizations. So if we go to the next slide, I'll just touch on a few examples here. And I'll start with the first three that are more, what are we as Google doing to reduce our impact on the earth? And then I'll share a few examples of the tools and technologies that we're creating to help others in their own practices. So I'll start with data centers. You can imagine Google has a lot of data centers to power the many applications and services that Google offers. In addition, there are many organizations leveraging Google's cloud computing services for their own purposes. So while the amount of cloud computing done in data centers is really increasing, I think the stat is like 550% between 2010 and 2018, the amount of energy consumed by data centers actually only grew 6%. And what I find to be really impressive is that we've applied machine learning models to optimize energy efficiency in our data centers. And so if you look at our data centers today, we get 7 times as much compute power out of the same amount of energy or power as 5 years ago. And so these are ways that we're implementing this kind of technology in our own operations to be able to drive efficiency. The second is renewable energy. So Google is the largest corporate buyer of renewable energy, with commitments reaching 2.6 gigawatts of wind and solar. And we've been carbon neutral since 2007. And that really speaks to, the leadership and that kind of embedded thinking from the top in terms of the way that we operate in our practices. When I think about this, I often have to kind of look back and I'm like, okay, thinking about the scale of Google, like, okay, it's really 100% renewable, and it is. And it's that kind of commitment that I feel like really helps drive not only our own practices, investment in these technologies, but also supporting local communities with investment in renewable energy. So the third area is sustainable workplaces. So, within our workplaces, we have practices that range from how we address food waste, buildings, transportation, and you could see some of those stats, in terms of our impact there. And I'll just point out the one related to transportation. We've implemented shared services like shuttles and electric vehicles, saving 33,000 metric tons of carbon through these practices. So that's kind of the Google side of it and some of the practices that we're doing. What I really want to focus on for the next few minutes is looking at how do we take the technologies and the practices that we have implemented in our own organization and be able to actually make that more available so we can multiply the impacts and make it easier for other organizations. So the last area is really the tools and technology, and that's looking at how do we influence behavior of individuals and then also enable organizations, policymakers to implement technology that helps them make more effective decisions and also helps them with efficiency in their own business practices. So I'll give you just a few examples of these. If we can go to the next slide, I'll start with what we call the Environmental Insights Explorer. So one of the challenges that many cities face is effectively being able to measure the carbon footprint. That's not always easy because it requires many different data sources. And for many organizations, they don't necessarily have access to those data sets or the ability to understand and interpret all that data. And so we've developed some tools to make that process easier. So we have our imagery, we have our own data sources, plus other data sources like NOAA data, and we've worked to create this tool that calculates emissions. And there's three types of aspects to this tool. One is emissions that come from buildings. The other one is transportation. And then there's a tool to identify the potential of rooftop solar. So a couple of things on the transportation side, being able to look at what is the impact overall of transportation in my community on emissions, and then also being able to drill down a little bit and look at modes of transportation, looking at inbound versus outbound trips, within city trips. And so there's a great set of tools there to be able to help quantify these things, to help cities be able to better look at when they do put practices into place, then what is the impact of that, and how does it impact their overall carbon footprint. So, so that's something that you can check out online and get more information on. The next thing, if you can go to the next slide, this is, we have our auto ML, which is our machine learning algorithms that we're working with energy companies, and this is a wind energy company. And if you think of things like being able to create more efficiency in their practices so that renewable energy is more attractive is an important part of their own operations. And so we've worked with AES on one of the aspects that is important in their operating practices is being able to do predictive and preventative maintenance. And so being able to look at, and identify cracks or other defects in the wind turbines to be able to address those before they become bigger problems, and to keep their uptime performance where they need to be. We worked with AES, and they originally had a process where it would take 2 weeks a year to go and inspect their wind turbines, and they've been able to cut that down to 2 days. And so, before they were using a lot of manual approaches, but they're able to use drones and collect lots of images. And rather than having, people sitting there looking at all these images, we developed some machine learning models to help drive more efficiency in that process of detecting, what's coming from those images. And it also let their staff focus on more higher order work. And so, you know, if you think of this, this can be applied to many different areas. It could be applied to vehicles, you know, trains, buses, infrastructure, being able to leverage this type of technology to drive more efficiency in terms of maintenance operations, which is a big part of, you know, industries that are very asset heavy. If we go to the next slide. So this is an example where we're working with the city of Memphis, and they have their public buses that are equipped with cameras. And so they're taking all this video footage in, and we've developed some models to be able to detect potholes and road conditions. And so this is helping them better prioritize where do they need to focus their road infrastructure and maintenance operations. And is driving a lot of efficiency in their operations. The other area that I think is really interesting is also looking at things like property conditions. So they're looking at being able to detect blight conditions so that they can look at some of these you know, underserved neighborhoods and be able to identify what are the areas where they should be focusing their resources, what types of practices and actions can they take. And if you think of some of the impacts of climate change, you know, from flooding to, you know, impacts on property, whether it's roads, buildings, other types of public infrastructure, being able to understand and detect these conditions and be able to know where are the most high intensity areas to be able to deploy resources is an important set of skills to be able to drive more efficiency in operations. So those are a few kind of more background operational types of tools that we've been working on. And the last example I'll show is more on the consumer side or the traveler side. So if we can go to the next slide. You know, I think several of the panelists mentioned we also need to, you know, be able to influence behavior. And when it comes to travelers, you know, many people use Google Maps to make some of their decisions. And so we're adding more multimodal options. So like bike sharing, real-time availability of bike sharing options. And then also doing more to like connect those trips to transit and the options that can help people get to transit. Because, you know, the more people understand what their options and the easier it is, as Sophie mentioned, they're more likely to make those choices. So those types of nudges that we can make and making that real-time information easier to access and making those choices easier to make in terms of shared mobility is another stream. So with that, I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'll wrap it up and send it back to you, Mariia.
Great, thank you. Thanks to each of you. Those were some great tools and strategies. I'm super excited to know that the bus tang exists in Colorado. I'd have to be part of my summer vacation. One kind of overarching question to get us started, and I'd love to hear kind of the different reactions each of you have kind of based on how it plays out. That a question came in about thinking about what are the successful strategies for engaging and building support from your legislature and governor. And the question was around, you know, thinking beyond electric vehicles, but I want to expand that because I heard from each of you kind of this different notion of really changing the political understanding and political support, whether it's thinking about this beyond EV or thinking about climate and safety issues and really approaching things in a radically different way to deal with, you know, I'm just struck that more people dying every day on roads than are dying from the COVID-19 crisis. And we are unable to change that mindset to equity issues and really thinking about how do we get our decision makers, our elected leaders to think about these issues in maybe a more radically different way. And so, you know, you're welcome if you want to respond to that of just like, what does that look like from beyond EV, or what does it mean bringing in the safety component or social equity, or however you kind of want to respond to that. But this bigger question of to get at scale, we need our elected officials to really be with us to think about these issues in a more integrated and urgent way. So how are you doing that? What are you finding is been working? What barrier have you faced that you're still trying to figure out how to unravel? So Stephanie, I'll start with you on that, but would love to hear from any of you how that's playing out in your state or city or organization. And you're on mute, Stephanie. Everyone, feel free to unmute if you're a speaker, and we'll just be more interactive.
All right, I am unmuted. It's a great question, and it's an important question when you think about scale. So I would say three things. One is that historically, active transportation has not been seen as having an infrastructure component. It's really been behavioral. And that's one of the things that leads to the safety issue, because the thing everyone says that when you want to make pedestrians and cyclists safer, you have to follow the 3 E's. You have to do enforcement, you have to do education, but you also have to do engineering. So there really is an infrastructure component. There are ways to build roads that are just safer for people who are walking, biking, or getting off a bus, and ways that are not. The good news is that relative to the size of most capital programs for most state DOTs, these are relative bargains, right? So my 5-year plan is actually now up to $20 billion. Carving out a couple $100 million of that, which is 1%, in order to do a lot with off-road trails, walking and biking infrastructure, and then also by requiring the accommodation of bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure in every project. It's not sitting off in its own budget item, right? It's just, I tell people it's the same thing. You have to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act, you have to comply with stormwater requirements, and you have to comply with bike and ped. And just like you don't break out the cost of stormwater compliance when you do your project and ask, your boss, can I take the stormwater stuff out to save money on the project? You can't take the bike and ped stuff out to save money on your project. So we've been able to invest a fair amount because there's a big constituency for active transportation, and the capital budget is actually not a place where it had gone. In our state, there was a statutory pedestrian and bicycle advisory committee that the governor was supposed to name that really hadn't been refreshed or done anything in a while. So we worked with the governor, we let people self-identify, we picked people from across the state, people of different socioeconomic groups, people from big cities, people from small towns, and then we put $60 million in our 5-year capital plan, not attached to any projects, and said, what do you want us to do with the money? Come up with a good statewide bike and ped plan, and we'll do it. So there are definitely ways. There's a lot of support. And then the last thing I would say is this. Most of the organized climate community comes through environmental agencies. And in many of our states, the state environmental agency is the lead on electrification. And they've pretty much let state transportation agencies off the hook, except every so often when they come to us and ask for money to put charging stations in. One of the interesting side benefits of the Transportation Climate Initiative is each state is at the table with their governor's office, their transportation agency, and their environmental agency. And I think it's actually created better relationships within each state across those agencies that allows us to talk both about the electrification and the beyond electrification pieces.
Makes a lot of sense. Thoughts from others? Thanks, Stephanie.
Yeah, this is Sophie. I'll jump in here. I think, from my perspective, thinking about who your audience is, I think, Stephanie was just talking about the environmental groups and how they're traditionally engaged sort of with the environmental agency. And I think it's certainly been interesting for us to see, we participated in the zero emission vehicle standard. CDOT was actually a party to that, which I think is, again, somewhat unusual. And really talking to those folks and encouraging them, hey, when the legislature takes up transportation, you guys should be thinking about how this impacts climate. And some of them absolutely are, but I think making sure that you make that point that this is broader than the utility sector, it's broader than cleaning up the grid, it's broader than electrification. Multimodal options are absolutely part of that. On the flip side, everyone cares about congestion and being able to sell transit to people who maybe will never take a bus, but as this will help benefit your traffic, I think that actually is something that many, many people across Colorado certainly can relate to. The third angle that sometimes we'll take is, just like many other states, we have a huge aging population. And if you look at a map of where those people live in Colorado, many of them do not have any transit options right now. And so really emphasizing that those basic options for people are going to become critically important over the next several decades, and that we have to start planning for that now. I think that gets a very different group of people interested in transit than have been in the past.
Great. And Mariana, I'd love to hear from you as well, and with a slight spin kind of going back to this equity issue. I know that Los Angeles, I think, kind of sticks out nationally as being one of those cities where social equity is really a deep commitment that the mayor and the city councilors and the county level government as well are really committed to. And I know also that LA is a prominent leader in NACTO, as well as in the larger Vision Zero community, set of communities. So I'm curious, as you think about this integration, does it look different in LA, given that work that you're doing that really lifts up equity? And or, you know, kind of how does that play itself out, particularly around thinking about new mobility options, greener transportation options, safer transportation options, and more equitable options? Because that's a lot. That's a lot to thread, but it's important to hit them all.
Right. I think they're generally interconnected. The equity piece, I think through our lens, is not a separate concern. It's part and parcel of our technical as well as design recommendations for streets. We do typically address our corridor work based on KSI and the need for those safety improvements. And Stephanie said beyond electrification, which resonates with me because largely when we interact with our elected officials and their staffs, we talk about overall benefits, quality of life benefits. This isn't an electrification project, this is a quality of life project. So using the framework of, you know, when you have people who feel more safe and are on your sidewalk, then your small businesses will benefit from an increase in shopping opportunities. And when we talk about how those interconnected experiences are considered, that's how we gain support. We also need to do our homework. We have our, and someone in the question alluded to, our digital intelligence and our ground truth. And I think when we're making recommendations, we really need to be keen on identifying what the numbers say and how those do or do not support what we know about what's actually happening out on the streets. And one thing, example I did provide was, for, you know, we have a crosswalk and we have the standards and the requirements for that crossing. But where's our wiggle room, if you will? Where's our gray space to make this really effective and meaningful, which lends itself to community ownership? It's not just a crossing, it's a way for me to get to the market. And that resonates with our decision makers. It resonates with our walkers and our pedestrians and our bike riders. And I think that's how we achieve equity. We need to marry the technical and the design to reflect our ground truth and really get us to our quality of life goals.
I'd also love to ask a question. I'll do a quick question that came in through the question and answer, and also to let folks know if you haven't seen this, we have had a number of questions, and most of those our panelists have done an awesome job of answering on the spot. So be sure to look to see if you got an answer written back to your question. But Manali, a question came in for you about, has Google considered or worked directly with any of the transportation demand management programs or employers to integrate the provision of financial or other types of incentives to facilitate travel behavior change? So I'd love to hear how Google may be thinking about that financial incentive piece and how the private sector could help play a role. That would be a game changer.
Yeah, I would say I think there's been a lot of work done in, it's by community, and especially in the Bay Area. There's been, you know, with so much of our employees there, there's the the shuttle service, you know, that's one way to kind of work to take a lot of people, you know, kind of off individual modes. So that's one of the strong incentives and, you know, what's kind of encouraged for people in terms of how to get to work. But I know that in the Bay Area, they also work with many of the agencies there. They all, you know, providing, a lot of it is providing incentives to employees to do things like carpooling, shared rides, and kind of discourage parking and driving. And so through the practices and policies that Google has with employees, that's the primary mode of implementing a lot of these incentives. But I know by community, there are different practices, you know, based on different geographies on the ways that Google works in local communities with the agencies as well.
Thanks. Anything else that others who've been kind of looking, I know Sophie, you mentioned a little bit about thinking about that issue around fees, whether it's an incentive or a disincentive. Don't know if you have more to add to that or anyone else.
Not so much on the incentive side, although I think that, you know, there is a lot of interesting work happening in the startup space around gamification of transportation demand management. And we have a couple of startup programs here that are, you know, carpool apps that can provide that sort of reimbursement. And I think being creative about those relatively low cost solutions that are literally at the tip of our fingertips to get people more aware of the ability to carpool and really just consider it as an option. I think there's a lot of exciting work happening there.
Maybe if I could just add one thing, like one of the other things is we're actually, you know, having a lot of conversations with transit agencies and DOTs about actually understanding more about behavior and what's happening, you know, with their own data, with data that we have, to actually help inform what types of things will actually influence people's behavior. So I think we're in those early stages. I mean, there's definitely agencies that have already been working on this, but looking at, there's a lot of data that agencies are already collecting, and how can you kind of leverage that and analyze it in a way that helps, you know, the operations team and the policymakers be able to make more informed decisions leveraging that data. Because we've heard from many agencies that right now it just, they're getting to some of these answers, but it's sometimes a painful process of trying to process this data and understand it, create reports, and it's a long process. And so how do we help that process become shorter and have more real-time data to be able to influence the decision making?
Great.
So I'd like to just raise one impediment and then one, you know, opportunity on getting more people to use shared modes to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also congestion. Because again, and when you're a state agency, mostly what you hear about is congestion. So a lot of what we're trying to do is to channel that frustration about congestion into things that will actually also reduce greenhouse gases, as opposed to things like building more lane miles, which will maybe temporarily ease congestion a bit, but definitely are a driver the wrong direction for greenhouse gases. So the frustration, or the place where there's an impediment, is we have very little technology to actually know how many people are inside a car. So it's really hard to price based on the number of people in a car. So just so we're clear, when you drive under one of those gantries and we take a picture of your license plate to send you a toll, we're not even allowed to point the camera inside the car. We take a picture of the license plate. So when people say, oh, can you use your automated tolling system to like charge people differently if there are a different number of people in the car? The answer is no. We don't know how many people are in the car and we can't tell. So that's an area where there might be a tech solution. And the truth is, even with, you know, Liftline and, you know, Google, and Uberpool, you know, the rate they paid was the shared rate. You don't actually know, in many cases, we have had a hard time getting the data on whether there actually were 2 or 3 people, or whether someone just, you know, took advantage of the rate and crossed their finger and hoped that in fact they got a cheaper rate to go by themselves. So we definitely need a tech solution if we want to do that kind of charging based on sharing people a discount. We've got a long way to go. The opportunity, and Sharon mentioned this at the very beginning, that I think the current pandemic gives us, is one of the things that we had identified as both a win for congestion and a win for greenhouse gases is actually telecommuting. So people on this webinar may not know this, but the second largest commute mode in the US is working from home. More people in 2019 worked from home than took transit across the United States of America. So transit is actually now number 3, behind driving by yourself and staying at home. And I think that because of what's going on right now, and a lot of companies are up in the ante on the technology that will enable their workforce to work from home and figuring out how to manage a workforce that's dispersed there. You know, a year ago, I ran into a lot of, I wouldn't say resistance, but concern when you talk to employers about, well, if you're so concerned about congestion, can we work with you to try to get some of your folks, you know, not to have to drive into the core at rush hour? And I think we're all learning, whether we want to or not, how a world based on telecommuting works. So it will be interesting to see when, hopefully sooner rather than later, we've gotten through this terrible pandemic, if the extra work that's been done actually allows for more telecommuting, which is definitely telework. And that's not just work at home. Telework can also be working from remote locations. It can be working sometimes in your office and sometimes from home. I think there's a huge potential on both greenhouse gas emissions and congestion if we don't all have to commute to the same places at the same time on the same roads.
Thanks, Stephanie. You brought up something I'd love to kind of tease out a little bit more, and that's this very real tension that I think exists. A number of studies showing that there's the very real situation that shared use mobility may actually be increasing our greenhouse gas emissions. And again, this kind of data as well as personal lived experience. I'll say, like, seeing lots of Ubers and Lyfts, like driving around the neighborhood that's filled with taxi cabs, that I'm like always shocked. Anyhow, I'm curious because I know that several of you have kind of looked under the hood at some of the data of what are you finding is happening, and really we have to do better than we're doing right now. Of just, it feels to me like crossing our fingers in some way that that curve won't be tilting up but tilting down as shared use mobility can hopefully be part of a climate solution. So I'd love to hear, you know, Sophie, I know when we were prepping for this, you talked about some research that Colorado DOT has been doing, looking at e-scooters, and if there's other data or experience or policy approaches that your organizations are taking to look specifically at this issue of how to ensure shared mobility is a green mobility option and not exacerbating an already bad problem.
Sure. Well, I'm happy to start. And to be clear, the report, which is on our website, and I'm happy to share the link with anybody afterwards, is really focused on what I would call ride sharing, delivery services like Amazon, as well as car share. And then we were actually asked to look at the growth of taxi services and sort of more broadly delivery. So it was a pretty broad group of folks, and I think it was interesting to see at least the forecast definitely shows that the VMT from these emerging mobility sectors is going to be pretty significant here in Colorado. And, you know, we're, again, a little bit further behind some other major cities, so that may be us just hitting where, you know, San Francisco is in a couple of years. But you know, we certainly identified the need to have policy intervention to help avoid that state that you're referring to, which is, I think, kind of similar to the heaven and hell scenario that folks talk about in the autonomous vehicle, you know, scenarios. And so I think, you know, I mentioned the fee structures and trying to put in place those policy incentives. You can go much more complicated in terms, you know, you could look at what is the carbon emissions from that. You could look at, you know, many other tools. You know, are they dropping off in diverse neighborhoods? Are they providing equitable access across the state? There's all kinds of different tools that you could try to control for. I think, you know, to Stephanie's point, the technical tools and the policy tools that we have at the state level are actually relatively limited, you know, intentionally to protect privacy, and that, you know, level of difficulty, I think, is an important thing for us to consider as government agencies. But, you know, there are some things that we certainly considered, especially along the lines of connecting transportation network companies to transit. And we have an example of that here in Colorado with our transit agency of Uber, and I think Lyft is now going to be part of this as well, where they're integrated into the transit app, and you can do, you know, single payment across all of those systems. And so I think to the extent we can encourage real shared mobility, where it really is encouraging transit use, it is encouraging more than one person in the, you know, more than one passenger in that vehicle. You know, that's really the end state that we're trying to get to. And I think it certainly is essential that we think about what are the policy tools to get there, because I don't think it will happen on its own.
So I think this is a really important question, because the question is not whether these new shared mobility modes and opportunities are or aren't directionally correct. It's how do we make them directionally correct, right? I mean, I think there is data that left to their own, we may not. And it's very different depending on which technology. So and a lot of it also depends, quite honestly, on what kind of trip you displace, right? So if someone who's in a transportation network company vehicle was gonna take transit or walk, that's not a net positive for either congestion or climate. But if they were going to drive by themselves and they're now sharing, that is a net positive. I think one of the opportunities that we're all interested in is this idea that some of the small vehicle technologies, especially if electrified, like scooters and e-bikes, could stretch the distance that we could use for active transportation. Not everyone is going to walk or bike a mile, and a very much smaller group of people are going to walk or bike too. But as we build out safe infrastructure for those vehicles to be in, I think both e-bikes and e-scooters have the potential to displace, you know, 2 and 3 mile driven trips. So that's a huge opportunity if we can do that. On the TNC side, the one thing I would say, and it doesn't make me friends with the folks in the TNC world when I say this, there's a fundamental problem with the business model, and it doesn't actually have anything to do with whether there's 1 or 2 people inside the vehicle. The fundamental problem is the business model depends on deadhead miles. It depends on you looking at your screen and seeing lots of little cars driving around that will come get you when you click. Those are called deadhead miles. When Massport looked at TNC trips to Logan, they were associated with 12 million trips, of which 5 million were deadhead trips, okay? No travel value whatsoever, big business model value, because the customers want to know there are a lot. So my challenge to the TNC world, more even than getting 3 people in the back seat instead of 2, is there a viable business model that reduces deadhead trips? Because all they are congestion and greenhouse gases and no travel.
That is a great challenge, I will say, to leave us on. I think we are just about at time here, and I know Sharon wanted to say some final comments to everyone. I want to again thank all of the panelists and thank our audience for being with us. And Sharon, I will turn it over to you. But you're on mute, Sharon.
Oh my goodness. Okay, now I'm not. So I just wanted to thank all of you for participating in this. This was an awesome panel, and I was feeling really bad that, like, I know there would have been standing ovations and applause because, you know, you're all working on the hard issues and struggling with it, but coming up with, these are the leaders. And just really appreciate that. And, you know, we have to get our virtual applause, I guess, together for that. But I think, you know, just a couple things, what Stephanie just said about the TNCs and other shared mobility, we need to, you know, we need to shape that, and because we need to take advantage of the opportunity it presents. And we need to be setting our goals, clearly setting our goals, and then measuring what we're doing, and then using policy and incentives to get where we need to go. And I think everyone on this panel gave great examples of how we do this. And we, you know, we need to think about, in this current pandemic, how do we take advantage of that opportunity? because it, you know, it seems very grim and we're all in our homes, but it also is a way to, you know, these are the moments when some big changes can happen. And so again, how do we make that work for the best? So again, I want to thank you and also let you know for everyone on here that tomorrow we are doing one more session. And the session tomorrow is called something like open ecosystems and walled gardens, and really addressing intermodal connections and the private and public role in that. So please join us tomorrow, and more information coming soon about our plans for the in-person summit. Thank you.